In the fall of 2022, Kupyansk became one of the symbols of Ukraine's spectacular victory in the east. During the Kharkiv counteroffensive, which we covered in a separate video, the Ukrainian army shattered the thinly held Russian line and recaptured thousands of square kilometers in a matter of days. Russian forces were thrown back across the Oskil River, and the city of Kupyansk, an important rail and road junction, was liberated. For the next 2 years, the Oskil served as a natural dividing line. The Russians sat on the eastern bank. The Ukrainians held the west, including the city itself, on both banks, as well as sizable bridgehead. At first glance, retaking Kupyansk makes little strategic sense for the Russian command. The area belongs to the Kharkiv region, the one that Russia never annexed, even on paper. But, proving, as it had again and again, that what it actually wants is the whole Ukraine, Moscow focuses almost the entire 6th Combined Arms Army on this city, the newly formed 68th Motor Rifle Division with its 121st and 122nd regiments at the spearhead, reinforced with a separate 27th Motor Rifle Brigade and elements of the 69th Division. And it was never just one army, several regiments of the 1st Guards Tank Army, in the past Russia's premier armored formation, which by this point had lost the entirety of its vehicles, formed the reserves. Interestingly, the renewed push on Kupyansk is led by Serhiy Storozhenko, a former Ukrainian colonel from Crimea, who had defected in 2014 and now commands the Russian 6th Army in the rank of lieutenant general. In 2023 and 2024, his first instinct was a direct armored thrust into the city, but all of those failed, beaten back by Ukrainian counterattacks and, above all, by drones. Having learned painfully that they could not simply drive into Kupyansk on the eastern bank, the Russians switched into the only method the drone-saturated battlefield of the 2025 still allowed: small, dispersed infantry groups that, despite heavy casualties, tried to infiltrate behind undermanned Ukrainian positions, accumulate, and then overwhelm those positions with sheer numbers and no armored support. By the start of 2025, Russians have managed to get their small infantry groups across the Oskil at several points, mostly north of Kupyansk, in the stretch of river running up through Dvorichna towards the border. These are not large-scale crossings. Early Russian footholds on the western bank are company-sized at most, covered by dense vegetation, often ferried overnight by civilian boats or across makeshift bridges. Ukrainian units repeatedly eliminate or reduce those bridgeheads through the winter, only for the Russians to re-establish them somewhere else a few weeks later. What made the difference over time was not Russian boldness, but Russian persistence, combined with sheer disregard for losses. Where a Ukrainian counterattack collapsed one foothold, 2 more would appear. Slowly, the isolated bridgeheads began to emerge in a process that resembled, in reverse, the Ukrainian operation at Kharkiv or Dnipro that we have covered before. But where Ukrainians scaled the crossings back, once casualties sharply rose, the Russians simply poured more cheap infantry in. At its furthest point, the advance still moved only 50 meters a day, somewhere around 8 kilometers over 5 months. To put that in perspective, this is one of the least efficient offensives of the entire war. Every village along the river basically switched hands dozens of times, as small infantry groups kept entering and dying there. Through January and February, the Russians pushed their footholds north along the Oskil. They established a permanent presence in part of Dvorichna at the end of January, then captured the village of Zapadne, and by late February claimed the border settlement of Topoli, together with Vigulivka. Claims are also made for more villages on the western bank. It's also worth flagging immediately, because it becomes a theme that many of those captures were disputed at the time, both by Ukrainian officials and even by Russian sources, who placed the front lines differently. In the absence of real successes, especially on the front, as stubborn as Kupyansk, the Russian General Staff began painting a new reality, first and foremost for the political leadership and Vladimir Putin himself. It's hard to say exactly where the lies began, at regiment, division, army or grouping level, but they propagated quickly up the ladder, and we will see the consequences of that habit later. Throughout March and April, the grind continues, with Ukrainians also counterattacking and recapturing villages such as Vigulivka. Despite having multiple brigades here on paper, the defense on the riverbank north of Kupyansk rests mostly on the elements of the rugged 15th National Guard Brigade redeployed here after heavy combat in Donbass, as well as on newly formed and still quite inexperienced and problematic units, such as the 151st, 154th and 158th Mechanized Brigades. It's also a good time to correct an impression that the Ukrainians were passive, simply absorbing the grind. They were not. The river was contested violently, and one episode shows just how far the Ukrainian side was willing to go to deny the Russians their crossings. Ukraine's military intelligence, the HUR, released a footage from its Timur special unit operating on Kupyansk axis. The operation had a specific purpose: to smash the Russian attempt to cross the Oskil and to keep them from expanding their bridgeheads on the western bank. Ukrainian special forces are inserted by helicopters directly into the Russian rear on the far side of the river, dropping assault teams behind the very crossings the Russians are trying to build. After that, SOF groups storm and clear positions, conducting artillery and FPV strikes and sabotage supply lines. The operation destroys multiple Russian accumulation points, 9 field ammunition depots and 8 river crossings, and puts more than 400 men out of action. It significantly delays the Russians, but does not erase their plans. At the end of May, they claim Stroivka, together with a number of other villages, where they have never been present, but the main Russian achievement is a successful infiltration into Kindrashivka at the beginning of June. By July, they finally grind their way into the city's doorstep in addition to border attacks. With at least 121st Motor Rifle Regiment present in Golubivka, Kindrashivka and Radkivka, Russian troops are in position to begin the push into the northern edge of Kupyansk itself. At this point, the fight for the city begins, and it is immediately expected to follow a pattern that has become familiar across 2025. The Russians take enormous casualties, pushing their infantry groups across unexposed areas. But once they start accumulating even on edge of the dense city blocks, a countdown begins. Those groups become far harder to find and destroy with drones, because the urban environment is the best possible cover against UAVs, so the advance speeds up and it becomes almost irreversible. In early August, Russian forces push not just into the city, but also around it, trying to envelop Kupyansk and secure supply lines. By August 3rd, the Ukrainians retake Kindrashivka, slightly complicating further infiltration, but it still continues through Radkivka. The fighting in this period has a back-and-forth quality that is hard to capture, because villages and city blocks change hands multiple times. But by August 24th, despite still being unable to retake Kindrashivka, the Russians significantly deepen their wedge around the city. To a great extent, this is possible because Russian soldiers begin slipping into the northern district of Kupyansk not in uniform but in civilian clothes. After working their way as deep into the Ukrainian positions as they can, at the appointed spot they usually display flags to the friendly drones. The photograph is the entire point. It becomes proof that Russian forces have reached the street or that building, fueling false reports, as though soldiers usually end up dead days or even hours after the performance. This is why the advance through Myrova and up to Sobolevka, which is supposed to threaten Ukrainian supply lines, becomes an extension of the gray zone rather than a real logistical cutoff. In early September, in addition to the land corridor, the Russian troops begin infiltrating into northern Kupyansk through an underground gas pipeline. This was not a brand new idea. Russian forces had used the same trick in Avdiivka and again during the fighting around Sudzha. But the Kupyansk pipeline was the most ambitious use of this tactic yet. It was a section of the Trank gas line, a little over a meter across, running from the area of Loman Pershi on the eastern side towards the northern outskirts of Kupyansk near Radkivka, a distance between 10 and 15 kilometers. A meter and change of steel pipe, just wide enough for men to crawl, became Russia's new road into the city. Pipe infiltrators are handed a small kit for the journey, a ration of water, instructions to change into civilian clothes when they emerge, and the map coordinates of the exit loaded onto their phone. Inside, the Russians move on wheeled trolleys and even electric scooters, with rest and resupply points along the route, crawling and rolling for kilometers in the dark with no real ventilation. Some groups wait inside for weeks, accumulating numbers and moving their dead back down the tube before crawling out into the city. Despite all of it, the pipe has one overwhelming advantage. It is the only way to bypass the drones. The build-up works at least at first, but the 12th of September, Russian forces push deeper into the city and establish more forward positions. By the 16th, they are fighting in the central Kupyansk. On the 25th, half of the city up to the key road that connects Kupyansk to Kharkiv basically falls into a gray zone, as the Russians dissipate and establish hideouts in dozens of basements and abandoned buildings. Here, they clash ferociously with the Ukrainian 19th Special Purpose Center of Military Police, which had basically grown into a SOF unit for close quarters urban combat, as well as with elements of other units. To understand everything that happens next, we need to zoom out from the urban combat and look closely at the conditions in so-called small skies around Kupyansk by the autumn of 2025. Both armies had, over the preceding year, established a dense kill zone in this sector with drones. Specifically around Kupyansk, the Russians weaponized this environment with a competence that deserves a closer look. From the summer of 2025, the 6th Combined Arms Army ran its own line of drones, borrowing the name of the Ukrainian program it was answering. The two systems shared a name but not a shape. Ukraine's line of drones is based on new specialized formations, eventually under the unmanned systems forces, drone regiments meant to reinforce the maneuver brigades holding the front and to push the kill zone beyond where organic land forces, drone teams can reach. The Russian version was less about new units than about method, also copied from Ukraine. The 6th Army organized the drone crews by echelons of depth. The first echelon, out to 5 kilometers, received at least 100 crews, including a company of the 16th Spetsnaz Brigade, flying jam-proof fiber optic FPVs and other drones to paralyze Ukrainian infantry and vehicles right at the front. The second, out to 25 kilometers, held up to 60 crews hunting antennas, relays, satellite terminals, electronic warfare equipment, artillery and supply routes, with Orlan, Zala and Supercam reconnaissance drones and Lancet and Molnia loitering munitions. The third, out of 35 kilometers, a handful of crews against rear drone launch sites and logistical hubs. Around 170 crews in total for the army that controlled a stretch of front line near Kupyansk. Above this army-level machine sat a second tier, Rubicon, the Russian Ministry of Defense's elite unmanned center, better funded and better equipped, flying the deepest and most specialized missions, with one favorite target above all others, the Ukrainian drone crews themselves, their control points, their antennas, their operators. The result, by autumn, was the situation we have described. The Russians had men in the city, an underground logistical route the drones could not touch, and a fire control bubble over the approaches. The Ukrainian answer centers on a unit we should introduce properly, the 429th Separate Unmanned Systems Regiment Achilles, commanded by Yuri Fedorenko, entered the Kupyansk sector in April 2025 as a part of original Ukraine line of drones effort, and in this sector it became the backbone of defense. Most importantly, they quickly understood that something has to be done with the pipe. Rather than simply trying to kill the Russians as they emerged, the regiment studied the pipeline blueprints, identifying every exit point, and then systematically destroyed the buildings and shelters around those exits, so that the Russian soldiers crawling out had nowhere to take cover. The pipe itself proved almost impossible to destroy outright. Ukrainian engineers consulted former pipeline workers and tried everything: airstrikes, rocket artillery, demolition charges set inside the line, and none of it permanently closed it. But those efforts degraded it enough to force a big portion of Russians to switch to infiltration through the river crossings. Losses rose sharply, as logistics at least partially collapsed, so with their advance into the city stalling against a drone-saturated defense, Russians did probably the least expected thing: declared that they had already won. While the Russians narrate what will become their imaginary victory, the Ukrainians quietly plan and launch a real and meticulously prepared counteroffensive, and they do it in deliberate silence. This is the heart of the matter, so it's worth slowing down and going back to late September. The Kupyansk counterattack is not one operation but two, running at the same time, each with its own commander, both sanctioned by the commander-in-chief Alexander Syrsky. The first task is to clear the approaches to the city and seal off the territory to the north and northwest, the ground through which the Russians are infiltrating, in order to build a barrier that would make it impossible for the enemy to keep getting in. That job goes to a specially assembled search and strike group built around the 2nd National Guard Corps Kharkiv, set up on the initiative of the corps commander, Colonel Igor Obolensky, and led by one of his officers, Colonel Sergei Sidorin. On the 21st of September, Sidorin is given 3 days to wield a fighting force out of secretly redeployed elements of the 13th Kharkiv Brigade, the 475th Assault Regiment Code 9-2, and 92nd Assault Brigade, the 144th Mechanized Brigade, and elements of the UR Foreign Legion. The second task is to clear the city itself, district by district, street by street, building by building. This operation is set in motion by Major General Mikhailo Drapati, recently reassigned to head a grouping of joint forces composed of the local 2nd, 10th and 16th Corps. His deputy, Brigadier General Viktor Solemchuk, is put in charge of the city clearing and divides Kupyansk into 6 sectors, each assigned to different units, among them the local territorial defense and mechanized brigades, special operations, security service and military police teams. Due to strict operational secrecy, all this happens unnoticed. So when a significant number of Ukrainian assault groups begin clearing the villages north of the city, the Russian command reads it as nothing more than a local skirmishes against scattered and isolated Ukrainian holdouts. It takes roughly 2 weeks before the Russians grasp that fresh, capable Ukrainian forces have entered this sector and that the operation is something far larger. The assault groups of the 92nd Brigade and the 475th Regiment crush the Russian positions around Kindrashivka and retake the village by the 9th of October. Take Kharkivka by the 11th, and by the 21st reach the Oskil, north of the city, severing the Russian route into Kupyansk from this direction. Throughout October and November, the Ukrainians decimate and force into retreat the battalions of the 121st and 122nd Motor Rifle Regiments, the 30th Engineering Sapper Regiment of the 68th Motor Rifle Division, and elements of the 27th Motor Rifle Brigade. They also pay a price, as the infantry and mechanized assaults in many places run into quite competent Russian drone crews that destroy vehicles and troops surging towards Oskil. Despite that, in fear of telling bad news to superiors, those exact drone crews never carry information about the breakthrough upward. They understand that if they did, the chances are high they would be sent at once into head-on assaults to retake lost positions. So, the lies become the key point of failure, even in presence of quite advanced drone component we described earlier, and essentially nullify this advantage. Meanwhile, the Russian High Command keeps operating under the assumptions that Kupyansk is being taken or nearly taken, even as the ground is cut out from under the men inside it. To put it in context, by October 21st, the Russians are still widening their presence in the city, infiltrating into the southern part and firmly holding entire streets of high-rise buildings. But that is a high watermark, as orders to advance continue to fly out while reinforcements are not coming. Without resupply, in the second half of October, the Russian advance hits a brick wall, and they make almost no real progress inside Kupyansk at all, overstretching too much. To show at least something, they switch to attacks in the area of Pyshanne, with some successes there, but with no infiltration into the western part of Kupyansk or Kupyansk-Puzlovy, despite active attempts to do exactly that. On the 26th of October, the Russian Chief of General Staff, Valery Gerasimov, claims that Russian forces have encircled Ukrainian troops inside the entirety of Kupyansk.
На направлении действия группировки войск «Запад» окружен город Купянск.
It is the first of the big claims, and it's obviously false. Through late October and into November, the Russian Ministry of Defense releases a steady stream of statements describing its 6th Army destroying an entire encircled Ukrainian grouping in Kupyansk.
Группировка войск «Запад» заняла стратегически важный город Купянск, который противник безуспешно пытается себе вернуть.
Claiming on the 8th of November, for instance, to have eliminated 10 Ukrainian soldiers holding their last positions in the city. No evidence is provided, and such evidence simply cannot exist. It is the Russians who are fully encircled, pounded every day by everything in the Ukrainian arsenal. On the 20th of November, Gerasimov publicly announces that Kupyansk had been fully captured by the forces of Army Group West.
Соединения группировки «Запад» освободили город Купянск и продолжает уничтожение формирований вооруженных сил Украины, окруженных на левом берегу реки Оскол.
The Ministry of Defense credits the 27th Motor Rifle Brigade and the 1486th Motor Rifle Regiment. General Sergei Kuzovlev, the commander of the West Grouping, repeats the claim in the presence of Vladimir Putin.
На Купянском направлении штурмовые отряды 68-й мотострелковой дивизии 6-й армии завершили освобождение города Купянск.
То есть все, закончили целиком?
Так точно, город находится под нашим контролем, уничтожаются отдельные мелкие разрозненные группы противника.
Content with the answers, the next day Putin declares that the Russian forces will inevitably repeat what had happened in Kupyansk elsewhere along the front, without understanding how comical it actually sounds.
События, которые произошли в Купянске, будут неизбежно повторяться и на других ключевых участках фронта. Может быть, не так быстро, как нам бы того хотелось, но неизбежно это будет повторяться. И в целом нас это устраивает.
On the 27th, he tells journalists that the enemy formations in the city have been fully liquidated, and on the 2nd of December he claims that all of Kupyansk had been under complete Russian control for several weeks now, pushing a narrative that even many Russian analysts by then refused to repeat. All because in reality, the scattered groups of Russian soldiers inside Kupyansk number only a few dozen men in total, cut off, hunted, and very far from controlling the city. The most striking moment in the entire information operation comes on the 9th of December. At the ceremony in Moscow, Putin awards Sergei Kuzovlev the Hero of Russia Star, the country's highest honor, for the capture of Kupyansk. At that very moment, Ukrainian forces have already retaken more than half of the city, and the search and strike group is out on another mission near a gas pipeline, dismantling what remains of Russian presence. A medal is being pinned on a general's chest in Moscow for the conquest of the city his army is actively losing. Having kept their counterattack quiet for as long as it was useful, the Ukrainians choose the moment to make it public, and the contrast with Moscow's claims could not be sharper. On the 12th of December, the day of the ground forces, President Volodymyr Zelensky travels to the Kupyansk in person.
Бажаю здоров'я. Сьогодні Куп'янський напрямок, наші воїни, які тут досягають результатів для України. Багато росіяни говорили про Куп'янськ. Ми бачимо, Я привітав хлопців, дякую кожному підрозділу, всім, хто б'ється тут, всім, хто знищує окупанта.
He records a video standing at the half-destroyed city limits monument bearing the town's name, while the 2nd Kharkiv Corps closes its encirclement of the Russians inside the city. The destruction of the pipeline itself comes on the 13th of December, when the Achilles regiment knocks out the gas pipe the Russians have been using as their main artery into the city, and critically important last logistical channel. In mid-December, units of the 121st and 122nd regiments push with suicidal persistence towards the eastern bank, into the Oskil microdistrict and towards Kupyansk-Uzlovy, and gain nothing. Their attempts to storm the Yubileyny district in the south end in the same way. On the Oskil bridgehead, the survivors are reduced to hauling everything by hand, because Ukrainian observation over the river, especially around Liman Pershi, makes the crossings nearly unusable. Their last ground corridor through Kindrashivka, Golubivka and Radkivka is controlled by Ukrainian guns and drones, and the only alternative left is resupply by air, drone by drone. The clearing that follows is a slow, careful building-by-building operation, similar in character to the fighting around Dobropilla, about which we already made a video. Of all the strong points the Russians hold inside Kupyansk, in their final days, none is more fitting at the end of the story than the city hospital. It had been shut down back in May, forced closed by the very Russian air and artillery strikes that had been pounding the city for months. By the winter, Russian infantry who infiltrated the city journeyed into the fortress. By the end of December, only about 100 Russians are left, concentrated in a single block of the city center. By early January, fewer than 100 remain fully encircled, their supply so broken that they cannot be sustained even from the air. Ukrainians clearing Kupyansk surround the hospital, and then, in the early January 2026, Ukrainian aircraft strike the building where the Russian soldiers are sheltering. The airstrike levels the medical complex to the ground, reportedly leaving no survivors. What follows is a long, grinding mob-up of a defeated force that refuses to disappear. The fighting concentrates around the hospital ruin and the high-rise district just north of it, where Ukrainian assault groups clear basement after basement. The Russians remaining on the right bank are now estimated at around 60 men, and the operation runs with a level of coordination the war rarely allows. There is no friendly fire, and every unit knows exactly what its neighbor is doing. On the 12th of January, Kharkiv raises the Ukrainian flag over Kupyansk City Council building. By late February, 97 to 99% of the city is under Ukrainian control, with a few dozen Russians and up to 10 uncleared buildings remaining. By the middle of March, the survivors, perhaps 20 of them, down from over 50, are reduced to sitting in basements and constantly playing hide-and-seek in large city. Using weather and foliage, occasional infiltrations of small infantry groups continue, but they hardly can threaten the city the way they did due to overall exhaustion of the 1st Tank and 6th Combined Arms Armies. After an operation that ran well over a year, if we count from the first serious infiltration attempts, Kupyansk remained in the Ukrainian hands. The offensive meant to carry Russian forces back across Oskil didn't make it even past the city. It got men into Kupyansk, it inflicted terrible damage, and at its highest water mark, it held much of the north of the town, but it never controlled the city, and by the end of 2025, the men inside were surrounded and being destroyed. The fighting has not stopped, it has only changed shape, moving from the city itself to the flanks and the left bank of the Oskil, but the grand objective was not achieved. Tactically, Kupyansk is a window into what ground combat has become. Mass and armor, the traditional instruments of offensive, have become liabilities in the kill zone, and so the attacker is reduced to infiltration, to a small group moving on foot at by night or crawling through the pipe, to reach a space the drones cannot see. And the Ukrainian counterattack proved the mirror image of the same lesson. An offensive operation can now be planned and won with almost no armor at all, built on reconnaissance strike counter to find and kill, and an infantry whose job is to consolidate and clear what remains. And then there is an information war dimension, which at Kupyansk reached a new level, but also became an important symptom. The premature declaration of victory, repeated by the Chief of General Staff and the President, the medal awarded for a conquest that was unraveling in real time, all of it is set against Ukrainian operation deliberately conducted in silence precisely so that the lie could do its work. By the end of 2025 and the beginning of 2026, this had hardened into the system across the Russian military. Settlements were reported as captured the moment a flag could be photographed in them. Ground was taken on credit, as Russian mill bloggers themselves began calling it, with the actual capture left for later, paid for in infantry, if it was ever paid at all. In the same week that Moscow declared Kupyansk taken, it declared the same about Vovchansk and Pokrovsk, cities where the fighting went on for months afterward. Remember where this story began, with lies born somewhere between the regiment and army staff propagating up the ladder. At Kupyansk, the circle closed. The lies traveled up to Putin, came back down as medals and further delusional orders, and the orders sent more men into a city that existed only in the reports, to die trying to make them true. In this sense, Putin's promise that Russia would inevitably repeat Kupyansk elsewhere along the front turned out to be one promise he actually kept. The gap between what Russian officials announced and what was happening on the ground became a new structural feature of the war in 2026, and Kupyansk will remain one of its cleanest examples.